She's carrying the child of the politician who abandoned her. But she has no idea the man who just saved her life inside that hospital is the most feared mafia boss in America, a man even cops and rival crime families are terrified of. One broke nurse, one blood-soaked empire, one secret about to blow everything apart. Stay until the end, like this video, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. The cold in Chicago that morning wasn't the kind you complained about. It was the kind that got into your teeth. Vivienne Mercer stood at the bus stop on Halsted, with her coat zipped to her chin, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, like she could hold the whole world together with 5 fingers and a prayer she didn't believe in anymore. Steam came off her breath in ragged little clouds. Her shoes, the same ones she'd worn through 2 winters now, had a crack along the left sole that let the slush seep in every time she stepped wrong. She stepped wrong a lot these days. Her balance wasn't what it used to be. 3 months. 3 months and she still hadn't said the word out loud to anyone. Pregnant. It sat in her chest like a stone she carried, but never set down, never looked at directly, because if she looked at it directly, she'd have to look at everything else too. The empty apartment, the unpaid bills stacked on the kitchen counter like a deck of cards waiting to collapse. The man who'd smiled at her over candlelight in a restaurant she could never have afforded on her own and told her she was the only real thing in his life. He'd been lying. Of course he'd been lying. Men like that always were. The bus didn't come. She didn't have it in her to wait for the next one. St. Dominic was 11 blocks from here and her shift started in 40 minutes. So she walked head down, arms wrapped around herself, counting cracks in the sidewalk. Because counting things was the only way she'd ever learned to keep her mind from doing the thing it wanted to do, which was scream. By the time she reached the staff entrance, her vision had gone soft at the edges, gray creeping in from both sides like curtains closing on a stage. She blamed the cold. She blamed the 12-hour shift she'd pulled the day before on 4 hours of sleep. She did not let herself think about the fact that she hadn't eaten anything since yesterday afternoon, because admitting that meant admitting she'd skipped the meal on purpose to save the $6, to put it instead toward the hospital bill that wasn't even hers. It was her mother's, 3 years dead, and still somehow costing money, like grief had found a way to keep sending invoices from the other side. She badged in. She put on her scrubs in the locker room with her hand shaking too hard to get the second button right. She told herself it was just the cold. It wasn't just the cold. St. Dominic Medical Center took up an entire city block on the near north side, a building of dark glass and pale stone that looked, from the street, like every other gleaming monument to American healthcare. Clean lines, soft lighting, a fountain out front that ran even in January because somebody somewhere had decided that elegance shouldn't be seasonal. Patients called it the best hospital in the city. Doctors fought for residencies there. Politicians cut ribbons on its new wings and posed for photographs beside placards that read, "Healing without boundaries." What none of them knew, what almost none of them would ever know, was that St. Dominic wasn't owned by a board of trustees or a faceless healthcare conglomerate. It was owned, every brick and every IV drip, by a single man who had never once held a medical license and never would. His name, on paper, was Roman DeLuca, billionaire philanthropist. A man Forbes had profiled twice for his quiet, almost monastic approach to wealth. No yachts, no tabloid scandals, just hospitals and shelters and scholarship funds with his family's name stitched discreetly into the corners. That was the version of Roman DeLuca that existed in newspapers. The other version existed in places newspapers didn't go. In warehouses along the river where shipments arrived at 3 in the morning under no flag and no manifest. In back rooms where men twice his age called him capo and meant it with their whole chest because they remembered what happened to the last man who hadn't. In a network of silence that ran from the docks to the courthouse to the precinct 2 blocks from St. Dominic's own front doors, a network built over 15 years of blood and patience by a man who had inherited an empire at 26 and made it twice as feared and twice as quiet in the years since. Roman DeLuca did not raise his voice. He had learned a long time ago that men who raised their voices were men who needed to be feared loudly, which meant they weren't truly feared at all. Real fear didn't shout. Real fear sat behind a desk on the top floor of a hospital, drank black coffee, and made one phone call that ended careers, marriages, sometimes lives, all without ever changing his expression. He was 34 years old. He had not slept more than 5 hours a night since he was 26. He kept an office on the executive floor of St. Dominic with a wall of glass that looked down over the emergency department's ambulance bay, and some mornings, when the noise of running the city's underbelly got too loud in his skull, he stood at that window and watched the gurneys come and go, watched strangers' worst days unfold 60 feet below him, and told himself it grounded him, reminded him what the money was actually for. He didn't believe that, most days, but he stood at the window anyway. He was standing there the morning Vivian Mercer walked into his hospital and, without knowing it, walked into the only soft place left in him. The ER was already loud when Vivian clocked in. Monday mornings always were. A parade of the city's bad decisions and worse luck rolling through the automatic doors in a steady current. A man with a dislocated shoulder from a bar fight that had started over a parking spot. A teenager who'd put his fist through a window and was now holding his own forearm together with a dish towel. An elderly woman whose daughter kept saying she's not herself in a voice that was already grieving. Vivian moved through it the way she moved through everything. Fast, efficient, swallowing her own exhaustion because somebody had to be the steady one in the room, and lately, that somebody was always her. "Mercer, Triage 3 needs you," Denise called from the nurse's station, not looking up from her screen. Denise had worked the floor for 19 years and had long since stopped looking up for anything short of a code. On it, Triage 3 was a woman, maybe 25, hugely pregnant, gripping the edges of the exam table with both hands, while her face went through the particular grayish color that meant pain was winning. Her name was Alana. She'd come in alone, no husband, no mother, no one, clutching a tote bag like it contained everything she owned, because, as it turned out, it did. "Contractions are 6 minutes apart," Vivian said to the resident, checking the monitor strip with hands that had gone steady the second there was a patient in front of her, the way they always did. Her own fear, her own stone in the chest. It went quiet when somebody else needed her. That was the only trick that had ever worked. "She's not due for 6 weeks, the resident muttered, frowning at the chart. "We need to get her up to L&D, now." That was when the doors blew open, not figuratively. Vivian would think about that word choice for the rest of her life. Blue. Because that was exactly what it felt like. The cold January air slamming through the ambulance bay doors a half second before the man came through them, and the man had a gun. Later, the police report would call him a 23-year-old named Devin Hale, high on something that hadn't fully left his system, looking for the ex-girlfriend who worked nights in radiology and owed him, in his addled accounting, an apology he intended to collect with a 9mm. He wasn't aiming at anyone in triage. He wasn't aiming at anyone at all, really. He was just waving the thing around like a flag, screaming a name nobody in the room recognized. And the room did what rooms full of frightened people do. It froze. Everyone froze except Vivian. She didn't think. That was the part she could never fully explain afterward. To the police? To Denise? To anyone who asked. There hadn't been a thought. There had only been Alana on the table, 25 years old and 6 weeks early, and directly in the gunman's line of sight if his arm swung 6 more inches to the left, and Vivian's body had simply moved before her brain caught up to it, stepping between the table and the door, between a stranger and a bullet. Her own 3 months pregnant body the only thing standing in the way. "Hey!" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Hey! Look at me. Not her. Me." The gunman's eyes swung toward her, glassy, unfocused, the gun swinging with them. "She's not who you're looking for," Vivian said. "I am. I'm right here." It wasn't true. It wasn't even close to true. But it was the only sentence her body had been able to produce, the only thing that might pull his attention off the table behind her, and for 3 full seconds, 3 seconds that felt longer than the whole rest of her life combined, it worked. The gun swung fully toward her. The room held its breath. Somewhere behind the nurse's station, someone was already dialing for security, for police, for anyone. And that was when the gray came back. The curtains at the edges of Vivian's vision, the ones she'd been fighting off since the bus stop on Halstead, finally won. Her knees simply stopped being knees. The floor came up to meet her in a long, slow, silent fall, and the last thing she registered before the world went dark entirely was the gun, and the shouting, and a strange, distant certainty that she was about to die for a stranger she'd known for 90 seconds, and that somehow, in that moment, it had felt like the first thing she'd done in months that meant anything at all.
A smile in his side.
60 feet above the chaos, Roman DeLuca was already moving before security even got the call. He'd seen it from his window. The doors flying open, the gun, the way every single person in that triage bay had gone still except for one woman in pale blue scrubs who stepped directly into the line of fire like it was nothing, like her own body was a cheap thing to spend. He watched her say something he couldn't hear through 60 feet of glass and a floor of soundproofing, watched the gunman's attention swing fully onto her, watched her hold that attention with nothing but her own spine and her own voice, and then watched her drop. Something happened in Roman's chest that he did not have a name for. 15 years of running an empire built on the calculated absence of feeling, and in the space of 4 seconds, watching a stranger collapse on a security monitor, something cracked clean through the calculation. "Lock the bay," he said into his phone, already moving, already shrugging into his jacket. "Marcus, get 2 men down to triage now, non-lethal. I want that shooter on the ground in under 30 seconds, and I want him breathing when it's done. You understand me? Breathing." "Boss, now." By the time Roman reached the stairwell, he never took the elevator when seconds mattered. The elevator was for show. The stairs were for results. His security team had already moved. 2 men in plain dark suits who looked, to anyone watching, like hospital administrators, had Devin Hale on the floor with his arm wrenched behind his back before the boy even understood what hit him. The gun skittered across the tile. Real Chicago PD would arrive in 6 minutes to take credit for an arrest they hadn't made. And that was exactly how Roman liked it. Invisible hands, visible order. But none of that mattered to him in the moment. None of it touched the part of his attention that was locked entirely on the woman lying on the floor of Triage 3, unconscious, one hand still curled protectively over her own stomach. Even now, even unconscious, like the instinct ran deeper than the body's own circuits could override. He crouched beside her. Up close, she didn't look like a hero. She looked exhausted in a way that went past sleep, past one bad night. Exhausted in her bones, in the hollows under her eyes, in the chapped skin of her knuckles. Her scrubs were a size too big. Her shoes had a crack in the left sole he could see even from here. "Get a doctor," he said, and his voice had gone quiet in a way that made the 2 suited men flinch, because quiet from Roman DeLuca was never a good sign for whoever was on the receiving end of his attention. Except this time, the quiet wasn't a threat. It was something closer to fear, an emotion Roman hadn't let himself feel in 15 years, and it terrified him more than any rival ever had. "Sir, the medical staff is already—" "I said get a doctor, the best one in this building, now." She woke up 40 minutes later in a private room 3 floors up, one she would later learn didn't officially exist on the hospital's patient board. No record, no bill attached, nothing. Sunlight came through tall windows onto pale walls, and a bed softer than anything she'd slept on in years. For one disoriented second, she thought she'd died and gone somewhere absurdly nice. Then the memory hit her. The gun, the gray creeping in, Alana on the table. And she shot upright so fast the heart monitor beside her bed spiked into a panicked beep. Easy. A voice, low, even, not loud at all. "You're safe. Everyone's safe. The patient you stepped in front of delivered a healthy baby girl 40 minutes ago." Vivian's eyes found him sitting in the chair by the window. A man she'd never seen on this floor before. Dark suit, no tie. The kind of stillness in his posture that made her think, irrationally, of a held breath. He didn't look like hospital administration. He looked like something else entirely, though she couldn't have said what. "Who are you?" Her voice came out hoarse. "Roman," he said. Just that. No title, no last name, nothing that would mean anything to her. And that omission was deliberate, the first lie of many he would tell her in the weeks to come, though in this moment it felt less like a lie and more like the only way to be looked at without all the weight that came with his real name. "I work here. Administration." "You don't look like administration." The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile, not quite. "I get that a lot." She pushed herself up against the pillows, one hand instinctively dropping to her stomach. and Roman watched the gesture and didn't say anything about it, though they both knew he'd clocked it. "I need to go," she said. "I have a shift. Your shift ended the second you collapsed on my emergency room floor." His tone stayed gentle, but there was iron underneath it, the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to be obeyed. "You're being kept for observation. 24 hours minimum, doctor's orders." "I can't afford 24 hours. "It's covered." "By who?" "The hospital." Another lie, smooth as the first. "Employee incident. You collapse protecting a patient during an active threat. We take care of our own." Vivian's jaw tightened, and Roman watched something flash across her face that he hadn't expected. Not gratitude, not relief, but something closer to suspicion, sharp and immediate, like she'd learned the hard way that nothing free ever stayed free. "I'll pay it back," she said, "whatever it costs. I don't take charity." "It's not charity if you earned it." "I didn't earn anything. I just didn't want to watch someone die in front of me." She looked away from him, out the window, and her voice dropped, quieter now, almost to herself. "I've watched enough people I love disappear. I wasn't going to stand there and watch a stranger, too." Roman said nothing for a long moment. In 15 years of running men twice his age, of staring down rivals who would have gladly put a bullet in his skull given half a chance, he had developed an almost surgical ability to read people. What they wanted, what they feared, where the soft tissue was beneath the armor. He read it now, in the set of her shoulders, in the way she wouldn't look at him, in the protective curl of her hand still resting low on her stomach. Pain. Old pain, layered over new pain, all of it wrapped in a pride so fierce it had become its own kind of armor. He recognized it because he wore the same kind, just dressed in better tailoring. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, like even that small thing cost her something to give away. "Vivian. Mercer." "Vivian." He said it once, like he was filing it away somewhere permanent. "I'll have someone bring you something to eat. You look like you haven't in a while." Her chin came up, defensive instantly. "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't." He stood, smoothing the front of his jacket, and for a moment the stillness in him shifted into something almost careful, almost gentle, an expression Roman DeLuca had not worn in front of another human being in longer than he could remember. "I said you look like you haven't eaten. Those are different sentences." She didn't answer that. She didn't know how to answer a stranger who spoke to her like her exhaustion was a fact to be addressed rather than a weakness to be judged, and the silence that followed felt, to both of them, larger than the room could hold. Roman left without saying goodbye. A habit, not rudeness. The way men who didn't like being watched leaving a room tended to vanish from one instead. Vivian watched the door close behind him and sat in the too-soft bed in the room that didn't officially exist, one hand on her stomach, and felt, for the first time since the candlelit restaurant and the lies that had followed it, something she didn't have a name for either. She told herself it was just exhaustion, the adrenaline crash, the hormones. She told herself a lot of things that day that weren't quite true. By the time the sun went down, the official version of events had already calcified into hospital legend. The nurse who stepped in front of a gun. Denise told the story to 3 different shifts with 3 different levels of embellishment. The security footage made its way, against several explicit instructions, into a group chat among the night staff. And by morning, half of the hospital had watched the 12-second clip of Vivian Mercer stepping between a gunman and a stranger like it was the easiest decision in the world. Nobody asked why she'd been swaying on her feet before the gunman ever appeared. Nobody asked why a 30-year-old ER nurse, by all accounts one of the most reliable people on staff, had clocked in that morning, pale as paper and shaking from more than cold. Nobody except the man 60 feet up, watching the same footage on a private monitor in his office at 11 o'clock that night, replaying the moment she swayed, frame by frame, like a man searching for an answer to a question he hadn't let himself ask yet. His head of security, a broad, gray-templed man named Sal, who'd been with the DeLuca organization since Roman's father ran it, stood at the office door with a folder in his hand and a look on his face that Roman had learned over the years to take seriously. "You wanted a background pull on the nurse," Sal said. "Got it back faster than usual. Figured you'd want it tonight." "Leave it." Sal set the folder on the desk and didn't leave. "Boss, can I say something?" Roman didn't look up from the screen where the footage had looped back to the beginning. Vivian stepping forward, chin up, voice steady, A woman with absolutely nothing left to lose standing between a stranger and a bullet. Say it. In 15 years, I've watched you order things done to men that would put most people in therapy for the rest of their lives. I have never once watched you watch a security tape twice. Sal's voice was careful, the voice of a man who'd buried enough bodies for this family to have earned the right to speak plainly when it mattered. You sure you want to open this folder? Roman finally looked up. In the low light of the office, with the city spread out behind him through 60 feet of glass, he looked, for just a moment, less like the man who controlled half of Chicago's underworld, and more like a 34-year-old who hadn't let himself want anything in a very long time. No, he said. I'm not sure at all. He opened the folder anyway. What he found over the following days built a picture that didn't match anything he'd expected, and Roman DeLuca did not enjoy being surprised. Surprise in his world usually preceded betrayal. Vivian Mercer, 30 years old. Born on the South Side, raised by a single mother who'd worked 2 jobs and died 3 years ago from a cancer, the family's insurance had only half covered, leaving behind a medical debt that Vivian had been paying down, methodically, $50 and $100 at a time, every single month since. A debt for a woman who could no longer benefit from a single dollar of it, paid anyway, because that was apparently who Vivian Mercer was. She picked up double shifts whenever they were offered, even now, even pregnant, even when the attending physicians had quietly flagged her file for fatigue risk. She volunteered every Saturday morning at a children's shelter on the West Side, an obligation that showed up nowhere on her resume, that she'd never once mentioned to a coworker, that Sal's people had only found by tracking a recurring 6 a.m. rideshare charge to an address that turned out to be a shelter for kids in state custody. And the father of the child she was carrying, Roman read that part of the file twice, and the second time, something in his chest went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the office's air conditioning. Senator Gregory Halloway, 46, married, 2 children. Relationship with subject, undisclosed, approximately 8 months, terminated by subject Halloway upon discovery of pregnancy. Roman set the folder down slowly, the way a man sets down something he's worried might detonate if handled wrong. Halloway. He knew the name the way he knew every name that mattered in this city, knew the man's voting record, his donor list, his carefully cultivated image as a family values reformer, knew, more importantly, that 2 of Halloway's largest campaign contributions over the past 3 years had come from shell companies that, if you peeled back 3 layers, led directly back to organizations Roman's own family had long-standing arrangements with. Halloway wasn't just a politician. He was a politician who owed people. The kind of man who, if a scandal threatened to expose an affair with a hospital nurse carrying his illegitimate child, would not hesitate for 1 second to make the problem disappear by whatever means were available to him. And Roman understood, sitting alone in his office at midnight with the city spread out below him and a folder full of one stranger's quiet, unglamorous courage open on his desk, that Vivian Mercer had no idea what she was carrying. Not just a child, a liability. A loose thread in a powerful man's carefully constructed life. The kind of thread that men like Halloway didn't leave dangling. They cut it, cleanly, permanently, and didn't lose sleep over the method. For the first time in 15 years, Roman DeLuca felt something that wasn't calculation, wasn't strategy, wasn't the cold machinery of protecting an empire. He felt something closer to the bone, something that scared him precisely because he didn't know what to call it, and the not knowing was almost worse than the feeling itself. He picked up his phone. Sal. I want eyes on Vivian Mercer around the clock, starting tonight. Discreet. She doesn't know. Nobody knows. You tell no one. Not the team, not the family, no one. And pull everything we have on Senator Gregory Halloway. Donors, schedule, security detail, everything. I want it on my desk by morning. Boss, can I ask what this is about? Roman looked out of the city, at the cold, dark sprawl of it, 11 million lights, and somewhere among them, one exhausted woman with a crack in her shoe and a debt she was paying for a dead woman and a child she was carrying alone. And he felt the careful architecture of his entire life. Empire, fear, control, distance, begin, very quietly, to shift. It's about making sure nobody touches what's mine to protect, he said. And then, hearing the words out loud, hearing how much they revealed, he hung up before Sal could ask him what exactly he meant by mine. He didn't know himself. Not yet. But something in him had already decided, in the space of 3 days, that he was about to find out, and 3 floors below, in a room that didn't officially exist, Vivian Mercer slept fitfully, one hand curled protectively over her stomach, completely unaware that the quiet administrator with the careful eyes had just declared, to himself if no one else, a kind of war. 3 weeks passed, and Vivian Mercer started noticing the coffee. It showed up the way good things showed up in her life now, which was rarely and with no explanation attached. A cup waiting on the nurse's station counter at the exact moment her shift hit its worst stretch, the slow bleeding hour between 2 and 4 in the morning when the ER went quiet and tired and mean. Black, no sugar, exactly how she drank it, which should have been impossible because she'd never told anyone how she drank it. The first time she assumed it was Denise. The second time, Denise looked at her like she'd grown a second head. "You think I got time to play barista at 3 a.m.? Girl, I can barely keep my own eyes open." "Then who? Maybe you got a secret admirer." Denise said it like a joke, already turning back to her charts, and Vivian let it drop because she didn't have the energy to chase a question that didn't matter. Except it did matter, in the small, exhausted corners of her mind where she still let herself wonder about things. Because she knew exactly who it was. She'd known since the second night, when she'd looked up from a chart and caught him at the far end of the corridor. Roman, in his dark suit, not looking at her, just walking past like a man with somewhere important to be. Except his somewhere important to be always seemed to root directly through wherever she happened to be standing. She told herself it was coincidence. She told herself a lot of things were coincidence that month, and most of them weren't. The neonatal wing at 11 p.m. was the quietest place in the hospital. A long hallway of soft blue light and the small electronic hum of monitors keeping watch over infants too small and too early to be anywhere but inside a glass box, fighting for every breath the rest of the world took for granted. Vivian came here on her break sometimes when she could steal 15 minutes, because something about standing in front of the glass and watching those impossibly small chests rise and fall made her own fear feel smaller too. If they could fight that hard for a body that hadn't finished forming, she could find a way to fight for hers. She didn't expect to find him there. Roman stood at the far end of the nursery window with his hands in his pockets, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, the most undone she'd ever seen him, and something about the rolled sleeves made him look less like an administrator and more like a man who hadn't slept properly in years and was finally too tired to hide it. "You're here late," she said, before she could decide whether she wanted to say anything at all. He didn't startle. She got the impression Roman DeLuca didn't startle at much. "Couldn't sleep. Must be a hospital epidemic. Half my unit's running on fumes. You included. I'm fine. You said that the first night, too." He turned to look at her, and in the dim blue light his eyes had a kind of stillness that unsettled her in a way she couldn't name. Not threatening exactly, but watchful, the way a man watches a door he's not sure is locked. "You say it a lot for someone who clearly isn't." Vivian crossed her arms over her stomach, a habit she'd developed without noticing, a wall built out of her own limbs. "Is that a medical opinion or a personal one? Does it matter?" "It matters whether I'm supposed to take it seriously." A small sound came out of him that might have been a laugh, if Roman DeLuca allowed himself laughs, which she was starting to suspect he mostly didn't. "Take it seriously. I don't say things I don't mean." Everybody says that. It's usually a lie. Something flickered across his face, fast, gone before she could read it fully, but she caught the edge of it, a flash of something that looked almost like guilt, like she'd accidentally stepped on a nerve buried deeper than she could see. He looked back at the nursery window instead of answering, and for a moment they stood there together in silence, watching small lungs work impossibly hard at the simple, miraculous job of staying alive. "That one," Roman said finally, nodding toward an incubator near the glass, a baby no bigger than his forearm, with wires taped along skin so thin it looked translucent. 26 weeks. Mother's a 19-year-old kid from Englewood, no family in the picture, comes in every day on 3 buses because she doesn't have a car. His voice had dropped into something quieter, rougher around the edges. "Nurses tell me she sings to him, every visit. Doesn't matter if he can hear her yet. You know that? I know things about this hospital most people don't bother learning." He said it simply, no boast in it, just fact. Seemed important to know. Vivian studied him. The rolled sleeves, the exhaustion sitting heavy under his eyes, the way he talked about a stranger's baby like the kid's survival was a personal stake of his, and felt something shift in the careful, defended architecture she'd built around herself since the candlelit restaurant and the lies that came after. She didn't trust easily anymore. She told herself she might never trust easily again. But there was something about a man standing alone in a hospital hallway at 11 at night, talking about a 19-year-old's lullabies to a baby who couldn't hear them yet, that didn't fit the careful shape of administrator she'd assigned him, and didn't fit the shape of threat either. It fit some third thing she didn't have a category for. "Why do you care?" she asked. "Really, you're an administrator. You run budgets and staffing and whatever else. This isn't your job." Roman was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. When he did, his voice had gone low, almost confessional, the voice of a man saying something true precisely because the hour was late enough and the hallway empty enough that the truth felt safe to let out. "Because I spent most of my life around people who only cared about what they could take," he said. "Money, power, whatever the next thing was. And somewhere along the way, I think I forgot there was another way to spend a life." He looked at her then, fully, and the weight of his attention felt like something physical. "You remind me there's another way." Vivian's breath caught somewhere in her chest and refused to move for a second. "You don't know anything about me. I know you collapsed in triage from exhaustion, and the first thing you asked, before you even knew if you were okay, was whether the patient you stepped in front of made it." His voice didn't waver. "I know you've been paying off a debt that isn't yours for 3 years straight, $50 at a time, for a woman who can't even see you do it anymore. I know you spend your Saturday mornings with kids nobody else shows up for, and you've never once mentioned it to anyone here because you don't do it to be seen doing it." He paused, and something almost like an apology moved behind his eyes. "I had you looked into. After the shooting, I wanted to know who I'd almost watched die on my floor." The hallway went very still. Vivian felt the warmth of the moment before curdle fast into something colder, sharper, her spine straightening, arms tightening across her stomach like the wall needed reinforcing. "You investigated me." "Yes." "Without asking." "Yes." He didn't flinch from it, didn't soften it, just let the words sit there between them, plain and unapologetic in a way that somehow made it worse. "I don't apologize for protecting what matters to me. I should have told you sooner. I'm telling you now. What matters to you?" Her voice had an edge in it now, something close to disbelief. "I've known you 3 weeks. You don't get to decide I matter to you. You don't get to dig through my life like I'm a file. Because you decided, what, I'm interesting? A charity case? Something to fix because your money got bored of fixing buildings." "That's not, I don't know what this is." She stepped back from him, putting space between them that felt necessary in a way she couldn't articulate. "I don't know who looks into a stranger's whole life over a security tape. I don't know what kind of administrator has access to do that. And I'm starting to think I don't actually know anything about you at all, which means I have no business standing in a dark hallway with you at 11 o'clock at night talking about feelings I shouldn't be having." She left before he could answer, walking fast down the hall with her arms still crossed over her stomach. And Roman stood alone at the nursery window, with the small electronic hum of monitors filling the silence she'd left behind, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like he had badly, catastrophically miscalculated. He found her 2 days later not because he was looking for her, he told himself that anyway, but because the hospital wasn't that large and certain paths crossed whether you intended them to or not. She was in the staff break room alone at 6 in the morning, sitting at the small table with both hands wrapped around a mug of something that had probably gone cold an hour ago, staring at nothing. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said from the doorway. "I work nights. Sleep's a theoretical concept." "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant." She didn't look up. "I'm fine, Roman." "You keep saying that word like it means something." He stepped into the room, careful, the way a man approaches an animal he's spooked once already and doesn't want to spook again. "I'm not here to investigate you again. I'm here to apologize. I did it badly the first time." "You don't apologize. You said so yourself." "I said I don't apologize for protecting what matters to me. I didn't say I don't apologize for handling it like an ass." A small, dry edge crept into his voice, almost self-deprecating, almost human in a way she hadn't heard from him before. I am. Apologizing, badly probably since I don't get much practice. Vivienne finally looked up at him, and the exhaustion in her face had a different quality than it had 2 nights ago. Not just physical tiredness now, but something heavier sitting underneath it, something that looked, to Roman's practiced eye, very much like fear. "It's not just you," she said quietly. "I need you to understand that. It's not just the investigating thing, although that scared me, more than I think I let on. It's everything. It's that I let myself stand in a hallway with a man I barely know and feel something for the first time in months that wasn't dread. And the second I felt it, I panicked. Because the last time I let myself feel something like that, I ended up pregnant and alone and lied to for 8 months by a man who told me I was the only real thing in his life, right up until the day I told him I was carrying his kid." Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough that Roman felt it land somewhere under his ribs. "So forgive me if I don't trust easy anymore. Forgive me if a man who has my entire life on a file somewhere in his office makes me want to run instead of lean in." Roman pulled out the chair across from her and sat, slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to tell him to leave. She didn't. "I won't pretend I know what that did to you," he said. "I won't pretend I understand what it's like to carry a child a man decided wasn't worth the inconvenience of staying for. But I know what it's like to learn, young, that almost everyone who says they care about you wants something from you in return." His jaw tightened just slightly, an old wound flexing under new pressure. "I learned that lesson at 12. I've spent 22 years assuming it was the only lesson there was to learn. And now? Now I'm sitting in a break room at 6 in the morning trying to convince an exhausted nurse that I'm not like every other man who's hurt her, and doing a fairly terrible job of it, because the truth is, I don't know how to be anything other than careful, and I think you need someone who isn't careful with you. You need someone who's just honest." Vivienne studied him for a long moment, the cold coffee forgotten between her hands. "Then be honest, right now. What do you actually do here, Roman? Because I've worked at St. Dominic for 4 years and I have never once heard your name before 3 weeks ago, and administrators don't usually have the kind of access it takes to pull a stranger's entire financial and family history in 48 hours. It was the question he'd been waiting for and dreading in equal measure, and for one long beat Roman considered actually telling her, the whole truth, the empire and the blood and the name that made grown men's hands shake, and then watched, in his mind, the way her face would change, the way every soft thing that had started growing between them in dim hallways and break rooms would curdle into the same fear that had filled Devon Hale's gun-wielding eyes that morning in triage, except worse, because this time the danger would be real, and it would be him. He wasn't ready to lose that yet. He told himself it was strategy. He knew, somewhere under the strategy, that it was cowardice. "I have resources most administrators don't," he said instead, which was true and revealed nothing, which was the point. "I use them carefully. I used them on you because the moment I saw you collapse on that floor, something in me decided I needed to know you were safe, and I went about it the wrong way. That's the honest answer I have for you right now. It's not the whole truth. I know that. I'm asking you to trust me with the rest of it later, when I can give it to you the way it deserves to be given. Uvars?" It wasn't enough. They both knew it wasn't enough. But Vivienne, against every careful instinct she'd built over the last 8 months, found herself nodding anyway. Some part of her too tired and too lonely to keep holding the wall up at full height. And Roman watched her nod and felt the cowardice in his own chest twist a little sharper, because he understood, even as he took the small mercy she was offering him, that he was buying time with a lie of omission that would eventually come due. "Was?" Senator Gregory Halloway's office occupied the top floor of a building downtown with a view of the lake that had cost considerably more than his Senate salary could explain, a detail his opponents had tried and failed to make stick in 3 separate news cycles. He stood at his window that same morning with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice pitched low and tight in a way his staff had learned to recognize as dangerous. "Say it again," he said, slower. "She's pregnant, Greg. Still. Obviously. And word is she's gotten close to someone at St. Dominic. Not a doctor, some administrator, but he's been pulling strings for her. Private room, no bill, that kind of thing." The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Curtis Pyle, An aide whose entire job for the last 3 months had been making sure the Vivian Mercer problem stayed contained, and whose voice now carried the particular strain of a man who suspected containment had already failed. I don't like it. Somebody with that kind of pull at a hospital that size isn't just some HR guy. Find out who he is. Already trying. Hitting walls. Whoever this guy is, his name doesn't show up on the hospital's public org chart at all. Holloway's hand tightened around the phone. He was 46 years old, 11 years into a political career built carefully, brick by brick, on an image of family and faith and reform that he had cultivated with the precision of a man who understood image was the only thing that actually mattered in his line of work. And Vivian Mercer, beautiful and stupid enough to fall for him, and now stubborn enough to keep the child instead of quietly handling it the way he'd assumed any reasonable woman in her position would, had become the single largest threat to that image currently in existence. He had told himself for the first several weeks that the problem would handle itself, that she'd get an abortion, or give the baby up, or simply disappear back into the obscurity she'd come from before he'd made the mistake of noticing her in the first place. He had been wrong on every count. She was still pregnant. She was still working her shifts at the hospital like nothing in her life had changed. And now, apparently, she'd found herself a protector with money and access that Curtis couldn't even identify. Find out who he is, Holloway said again, quieter this time, which was always worse than loud. And find out fast, because if this child becomes public before the election cycle starts, I don't have a campaign. I have a punchline. Do you understand what that means for everyone attached to me? For you? I understand. Then handle it. He hung up before Curtis could ask what handle it meant exactly, because Holloway himself wasn't entirely sure yet, and a man in his position had learned a long time ago that the specifics of handling things were best left vague right up until the moment they weren't. The next 2 weeks built something between Roman and Vivian that neither of them had a name for, and both of them, separately, were too afraid to examine too closely. It existed mostly in small things. Coffee that kept appearing at the exact right moment. A ride home one bitter night when her usual bus never came. Roman appearing in the staff lot in a plain black car with no driver, just himself, insisting it was on his way, even though street. Dominic was nowhere near wherever Roman DeLuca actually lived. A conversation in the cafeteria at 2 a.m. about nothing. Her childhood, a dog she'd had as a kid, the particular ache of growing up in a house where money was a thing that disappeared faster than it arrived, that went on for 40 minutes and left both of them later than either could afford to be for the next day's responsibilities. He never touched her. That mattered to Vivian more than she let herself admit. That whatever this was building toward, Roman seemed determined to let it grow at the speed she could survive. No pressure, no expectation, just presence. Steady and patient in a way that didn't match anything she'd experienced from a man before. Holloway had moved fast, charming and urgent, sweeping her off her feet specifically because feet swept off the ground couldn't ask hard questions until it was too late. Roman did the opposite. Roman waited. It should have made her trust him more. Instead, it made her suspicious in a different way, because men who waited that patiently, that deliberately, were either the safest men in the world or the most dangerous ones, and she genuinely couldn't tell which Roman was, and the not knowing kept her up some nights almost as much as the exhaustion did. She found out which one he was on a Tuesday night in February in the hospital's underground parking structure, by accident, the way most of the worst discoveries in a person's life tend to arrive. She'd left her badge in her locker, a stupid mistake, the kind exhaustion produced reliably, and had to go back down for it after her shift ended near midnight, taking the back stairwell because it was faster than waiting for the elevator with her feet aching the way they did every night now. The stairwell led out near the lower level of the parking structure, a part of the garage she rarely had reason to visit, dim and concrete and humming with the distant sound of the building's mechanical systems. She heard the voices before she saw anything. Low, urgent, more than one man, coming from around the corner near the loading bay where the hospital's supply trucks usually parked. She almost kept walking. Almost, except something in the tone caught her, an edge of violence under the words that didn't belong anywhere near a hospital. And curiosity, or maybe instinct, made her slow her steps instead of speeding them up. She rounded the corner enough to see, and immediately wished she hadn't. 4 men stood in a loose half-circle around a fifth, who was on his knees on the concrete with his hands zip-tied behind his back, blood running from his nose down over his lips in a thin, dark line. One of the standing men, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, a face Vivian vaguely recognized from somewhere in the hospital's administrative wing, held the kneeling man's head up by his hair, forcing his face toward a sixth figure who stood slightly apart from the others, arms crossed, expression carved from something colder than Vivian had ever seen on him before. Roman. "You think I wouldn't find out?" Roman was saying, and his voice, that same low, even voice that had talked to her about premature babies and lullabies in a darkened nursery, had transformed into something that didn't sound human anymore, something flat and final and utterly without mercy. "You sold our shipment schedule to the Kozlov people for what, 50 grand? You sold 15 years of trust for 50 grand, Danny. Roman, please, I swear I didn't. Don't." The word cracked through the garage like a whip, and the kneeling man, Danny, flinched so hard the man holding his hair had to tighten his grip to keep him steady. "Don't lie to me in my own building. You think I built this empire being stupid? I have the wire transfers, I have the texts. I have your face on a camera outside a Kozlov safe house on 3 separate Tuesdays, Danny. So do not, for the love of whatever you think you believe in, insult me with a lie right now. Because it is the last thing you will ever say to me, and I would prefer it be true." Vivian's hand flew to her mouth, too late to stop the small gasp that escaped, and in the absolute silence of the parking structure, it carried like a gunshot. Every head turned. Roman's eyes found her in the dim light, and for one suspended second, something passed across his face that she had never seen there before. Not the gentle administrator from the nursery window, not the patient man who'd waited weeks to so much as hold her hand, but something underneath all of that. Something that had apparently been there the whole time, wearing the gentle version like a coat. Recognition. Then, immediately after, something that looked almost like horror, not at what he'd been caught doing, but at the fact that it was her, specifically her, standing in the doorway watching him become the thing he actually was. "Capo," one of the men near Danny said, low, urgent. "We got a problem." "I see it," Roman said, and his voice had gone quiet again, but it was a different quiet now, the quiet of a man recalculating everything in real time. "Vivian." She didn't wait to hear what came after her name. She turned and ran, badge forgotten, feet pounding up the stairwell 2 at a time, despite 8 months of pregnancy screaming protest in her hips and her lower back, her breath tearing out of her in short, panicked bursts, her mind racing through everything. The coffee, the rides home, the lullabies, the careful patient waiting, all of it recoloring itself in real time into something monstrous. A performance, a long con run by a man whose men called him Capo in a parking garage while he tortured a stranger for information. She didn't stop running until she reached the staff lot, until she was in her own car with the doors locked and her hand shaking too hard to get the key into the ignition, hyperventilating, one hand pressed against her belly, like she could shield the baby from a truth that had already irreversibly gotten in. The gentle administrator she'd let herself trust was a lie. The man she'd let herself feel something for was a criminal. Worse than a criminal, the kind of man other criminals called capo and feared. The kind of man who knelt a person down on cold concrete and dismantled them with nothing but his voice. She didn't know what capo meant exactly, not with certainty, but she'd grown up on the South Side. She'd heard the word in passing her whole life, in old movies and in whispers about men nobody talked about directly. And the cold, sick drop in her stomach told her everything her vocabulary couldn't. Her phone buzzed in her lap. Roman. She stared at the screen until it stopped ringing, then immediately buzzed again. And again, 6 times in a row, each one feeling like an accusation she didn't know how to answer. She didn't answer. She started the car instead, hands still shaking, and pulled out of the lot into the freezing dark, driving nowhere in particular, just away, just putting distance between herself and a hospital that had stopped in the space of 90 seconds, feeling like anywhere safe at all. Roman didn't chase her. He wanted to. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to abandon Danny right there on the concrete and run after her, explain, fix it, undo the 90 seconds that had just unmade 3 weeks of careful, patient work. But he'd built an empire on knowing which battles required immediate action and which ones required restraint. And some animal part of his brain, even in the chaos of the moment, understood that chasing a terrified pregnant woman through a parking garage at midnight would not make her feel safer. It would confirm every fear currently exploding through her mind. "Sal," he said instead, voice flat, already moving into damage control even as something in his chest tore open in a way 15 years of running this life had never managed to do. "Get him out of here. Clean this up. I want eyes on Vivian Mercer's apartment within the hour. And I mean discreet. I mean, she does not know they're there, but I want someone on her 24/7 starting now." "Boss, what about Danny?" Roman looked down at the man kneeling on the concrete, blood drying on his lips, and felt, for one disorienting moment, almost nothing at all. Like the part of him capable of righteous fury at betrayal had been entirely overwritten by the much larger fury currently building at himself, at his own cowardice, at 15 years of secrets that had just detonated in front of the one person he'd actually wanted to keep them from. "Hold him," Roman said. "I'll deal with him tomorrow. Tonight I have a bigger problem." He left the garage without another word, walking fast toward his car, already dialing Vivian's number for the 7th time, already composing in his head the impossible speech that might somehow explain why the gentle man from the nursery and the man who'd just made Danny Reyes beg for his life on cold concrete were, in fact, the exact same person, and getting nowhere because there was no version of that explanation that didn't end with her running further and faster, and he understood, with a clarity that felt like grief, that he had badly underestimated how little time he actually had left before the world he'd spent 15 years building came directly for the one good thing in it. But let's see. Vivian drove for 40 minutes before she let herself stop, pulling into the empty lot of an all-night diner 3 neighborhoods from her apartment, engine ticking as it cooled, her own breath finally starting to slow from panic into something closer to exhausted, frightened thought. She didn't go inside. She sat in the dark car with both hands on the wheel and replayed the scene in the parking garage over and over. Danny on his knees, the blood, Roman's voice gone flat and merciless, the word capo hanging in the concrete air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Her phone had stopped buzzing. She checked it anyway, out of some compulsion she couldn't name, and found 11 missed calls and a single text message that had come through somewhere during the drive. "I'm not going to pretend this isn't exactly what it looked like. I owe you the truth, all of it, and I will give it to you whenever you're ready to hear it. But please, Vivian, wherever you are right now, please be somewhere safe. There are things about your situation you don't know yet, things that have nothing to do with what you just saw, and I am genuinely afraid for you. Call me when you can. Or don't. But please be safe." She read it 3 times. She didn't call. She drove home instead, checking her mirrors more than she'd ever checked them in her life, parked half a block from her building out of some new instinct she didn't fully understand yet, and let herself into her dark, cold apartment with her heart still hammering, locking the deadbolt in the chain. Both standing in the entryway in the dark with one hand pressed flat against her stomach, feeling the baby shift restlessly inside her like it, too, had absorbed some of the fear flooding her bloodstream. "I just didn't want to watch someone die in front of me," she'd told him, weeks ago, in a hospital bed, in a room that didn't officially exist. She had no idea, standing alone in the dark, how soon she'd be tested on exactly how far that instinct went. Because 3 blocks away, in a car with its headlights off, 2 men were already watching her building, and they had not been sent by Roman DeLuca. The headlights stayed dark for 11 minutes before the first man got out of the car. Vivian didn't see him. She was 3 floors up, deadbolt thrown, chain across the door, sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark, because turning on a lamp felt, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, like announcing herself to a world that had just shown her exactly how much it could hide in plain sight. Her phone sat face down on the nightstand. 11 missed calls had become 14. She hadn't looked at the new ones. The man who got out of the car was not subtle by training. He was subtle by necessity. A big man trying to make himself small, moving along the far side of the street where the streetlight had burned out 2 winters ago and the city had never gotten around to fixing it. He wore a jacket too thin for the cold, the kind of detail that would have told a careful observer he wasn't planning to be outside long. He stopped across from Vivian's building and looked up at the dark windows, counting floors, and Vivian, who could not see him, who had no idea he existed, lay back on her bed with one hand on her stomach and tried to remember how to breathe in a rhythm that didn't feel like drowning. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark replaying Roman's voice in the parking garage, Don't lie to me in my own building. And underneath the fear, underneath the betrayal, something colder and more practical had started assembling itself in the back of her mind. The same instinct that had once stepped her between a gunman and a stranger without conscious thought. Something was wrong. Not wrong in the way she'd assumed walking up those stairs. Wrong in a way that hadn't fully announced itself yet, but that she could feel coming the way you feel weather change in an old injury. At 2 a.m, her phone buzzed once more, and this time it wasn't a missed call. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. Mr. Holloway sends his regards. He'd like to discuss the future of your situation. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. The address below. Come alone. Don't make this complicated, Miss Mercer. You don't want to find out what complicated looks like. She read it 4 times, her thumb hovering over the screen, the cold finally reaching all the way down into her chest. Below the message was an address she recognized. A building downtown, glass and steel, the kind of building that belonged to men who never got their own hands dirty. She thought about calling the police. She thought about calling Roman. She sat in the dark with the phone glowing in her hand and didn't do either, because some new, hard part of her, the part that had apparently been growing this whole time underneath the exhaustion and the grief, had already decided that the only person who could tell her the truth about any of this was the man currently threatening her, and the only way to get that truth was to walk directly toward it. It was, she would think later, the single stupidest decision of her life. It was also, in its own way, the bravest. Roman did not sleep either. He spent the night in his office with the security feed from Vivian's street open on one monitor and Sal's surveillance report scrolling across another, watching a man in a thin jacket pace the sidewalk across from her building for 40 minutes before finally retreating to his car, watching the small green dot that represented her phone never move from the 3rd floor. Watching. Doing the one thing 15 years in this business had taught him was both the most useless and the most necessary act available to a powerful man, waiting, helpless, for morning. At 6 a.m., Sal came in without knocking, which told Roman before a single word was spoken that whatever Sal had to say wasn't going to be good. We pulled the plate on the car outside her building, Sal said, dropping a printout on the desk. Registered to a shell, same shell that's tied to 2 campaign donors we already had flagged on Holloway. This isn't random, boss. He sent people to watch her. Roman's jaw worked once, hard, a muscle ticking under skin gone pale with 12 hours of no sleep and an entire night spent imagining every version of what could happen to a pregnant woman who didn't know she was being hunted by a man with a Senate seat and nothing left to lose. Watched, or just watched, for now. Sal's voice carried the particular weight of a man who'd delivered worse news in this office before and knew the value of getting to the point. But boss, you need to hear this part. Danny talked last night before anything happened to him. He gave up the Kozlov contact, and the Kozlov people aren't just buying our shipping routes. Sal hesitated, which Roman had also never seen him do. They're working with Holloway's people. Somebody made an introduction. Somebody on the inside connected a Senate candidate's fixer to a rival family that's been trying to take territory off us for 3 years. And the only reason to make that introduction is if both sides found something they both wanted gone. The silence in the office stretched long enough that the city outside the window seemed to hold its breath along with it. They want her dead, Roman said. It wasn't a question. They want the problem gone, Sal said carefully. Whether that means the kid disappears into some quiet arrangement, or whether it means something worse, I don't know yet. But I know the Kozlovs don't do quiet arrangements, boss. That's not how they operate. And I know Holloway doesn't have the stomach to get his own hands dirty, which is exactly why a man like that reaches out to people who don't mind dirt. Roman stood up so fast his chair rolled back and hit the wall behind him. Get the car. Boss, I am done being careful, Sal. His voice had gone to a place Sal had heard maybe 3 times in 15 years of service, a register that meant every other consideration in Roman DeLuca's life had just been set aside in favor of exactly one. Get the car. Now, man. Vivian arrived at the address downtown at 9:52, 8 minutes early, wearing a coat that didn't quite close over the curve of her stomach anymore and carrying nothing but her phone and a fear so total it had, somewhere around 5 in the morning, burned itself down into something flatter and steadier. Not bravery exactly, but its exhausted cousin, the calm of a person who has run out of better options. The lobby was marble and brass and silence, the kind of silence that costs money to maintain. A man in a dark suit who was clearly not hotel staff intercepted her at the elevator bank without introducing himself, simply nodding toward the open car like she was expected, which she supposed she was. She rode up 40 floors with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. One hand pressed against her belly, murmuring something wordless and useless to the baby inside her, a promise she had no power yet to keep. Gregory Holloway's office took up the entire top floor, all glass and lake view and furniture that whispered the particular kind of expense that tried very hard not to look expensive. He stood at the window when she entered, his back to her, and didn't turn around right away. A power move. She recognized it as one even through her fear, the kind of small theater powerful men performed because somewhere along the way they decided it made them more powerful. Vivienne. He finally turned. He looked older than she remembered, the campaign trail tan gone slightly gray underneath, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 8 months ago when he'd told her, over candlelight, that she was the only honest thing left in his life. You look well, considering. Considering what, Greg? Considering everything. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. She didn't sit. He let the silence acknowledge that and didn't push it. I'll be direct, since I understand directness is something you respect. I need this situation resolved before it becomes a liability to my campaign. I'm prepared to be generous about it. Generous. The word came out of her flat, disbelieving. You ghosted me 8 months ago. You blocked my number. You had your office call me twice to tell me very politely that any further contact would be considered, and I quote, inappropriate given your professional relationship to the Senator's Family Foundation. I don't work for your foundation, Greg. I never did. That was a lie you fed your staff so they'd have a script to read me. I had to protect my family. You had a baby with me and decided the family you wanted to protect was the one that came after. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The flatness of it cut deeper than volume would have. So don't stand there in your $40,000 suit and use the word generous like it means something coming out of your mouth. Something tightened in Holloway's jaw. Not anger exactly, something more practiced. The look of a man recalibrating a negotiation that wasn't going the way his staff had scripted it. I'm prepared to offer $2 million, he said, structured through a private trust, fully confidential, in exchange for a legal agreement that severs any future claim on my name, my estate, or my political career. The child will be provided for. You will be provided for. And this entire chapter of both our lives can end quietly, the way it should have ended months ago. But Vivienne stared at him, and for one long beat the fear in her chest gave way to something closer to disgust, clean and total. You think this is about money? I think $2 million solves most people's problems. This isn't most people's problem. This is your problem, Greg. You're the one who can't survive an affair becoming public 8 months before a primary. I'm just the inconvenient evidence. She took a step closer to his desk, and despite everything, the exhaustion, the fear, the 8 months of carrying this alone, her spine had gone straight, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. I don't want your money. I never wanted your money. I wanted you to show up. You didn't. So now I'm going to raise this child without you, and you are going to live the rest of your career terrified that one day they're going to look enough like you that somebody notices, and there is not enough money in your trust fund to make that fear go away. Holloway's composure finally cracked, just slightly, a flush climbing up from his collar. You don't understand what you're playing with. I think I'm starting to. This isn't a negotiation you walk away from feeling proud of yourself, Vivienne. His voice dropped, quieter now, and something in the quiet made the hair on her arms rise, an echo of the same register she'd heard in Roman's voice the night before in the parking garage. The sound of a man dropping a mask he'd worn so long he barely remembered it was a mask. I have people who handle problems I can't handle myself. I would much rather this stay a conversation about money, but I need you to understand that it does not have to stay that way. And the people I'd have to involve if it doesn't are not the kind of people who care whether you're carrying a child or not. The room went very still. Vivienne's hand found her stomach without her permission, a purely instinctive gesture, and Holloway watched her do it with an expression that contained, for one unguarded second, something that might have been the closest he'd come to actual remorse, quickly buried, replaced by the cold practicality of a man who had already decided, somewhere in the calculus of his own survival, that remorse was a luxury he couldn't afford. "You're threatening me," she said. "I'm informing you of consequences. There's a difference if you let there be." She didn't get to answer, because that was the exact moment the office door opened without a knock, and Roman DeLuca walked in like he owned the building, which, Vivian would learn in the next 4 minutes, he very nearly did. Holloway's security detail, 2 men stationed outside the office, were not in the hallway when Roman walked through. Vivian would learn later that Sal's men had relieved them of their posts 30 seconds earlier, quietly, professionally, the way men who'd done this 1,000 times handled things that needed handling without bloodshed when bloodshed wasn't yet required. Roman crossed the office floor in 4 strides and put himself directly between Vivian and Holloway's desk, his back partially to her, a wall built out of a single human body. And when he spoke, his voice had none of the gentleness she'd heard in nursery hallways and break rooms. It had all of the flatness she'd heard in the parking garage, and underneath that flatness, something colder still, a fury so controlled it was almost worse than if he'd shouted. "Get your hands off of whatever pen you're reaching for, Senator," Roman said, "because the next move you make in this room is going to determine whether you walk out of this building under your own power." Holloway's hand froze halfway to the desk drawer. The color drained from his face in a way that confirmed instantly and completely that whatever Roman DeLuca actually was, Gregory Holloway already knew it. "DeLuca," he said, and the name came out of him like a confession. "I didn't know you were... I had no idea she was connected to..." "You knew," Roman said. "Don't insult both of us by pretending otherwise. You knew the second your people couldn't pull a single piece of information on the man protecting her. Men like you don't get to that altitude without learning which doors not to knock on. You knocked on mine anyway." Vivian stood frozen behind him, her mind racing to keep pace with what was unfolding. Holloway's fear, instant and total, the way he'd gone from cold negotiator to something closer to a man facing a sentence, all in the 4 seconds it took Roman to cross the room. Connected. Protecting her. The words arranged themselves into a shape she didn't want to look at directly, the same shape from the parking garage, except now lit up under fluorescent office lighting with nowhere left to hide from it. "Roman," she said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "What is he talking about?" Roman didn't turn around. His attention stayed locked on Holloway, who had gone very still behind his desk, the practiced charm of the campaign trail entirely stripped away to reveal something pale and frightened underneath it. "Not now, Vivian." "No!" Her voice came back sharper this time, fear curdling fast into something closer to anger. Not now. Now! You walk in here like you own this building, the Senator of the United States looks like he's about to be sick just from saying your name, and you want me to wait for an explanation? I've been waiting for an explanation since last night, Roman. I watched you torture a man in a parking garage. I have spent 12 hours wondering if I was about to be murdered in my own apartment. I think now is exactly the right time. Holloway, despite his fear, despite the obvious danger radiating off the man standing between him and his desk, found something that might have been opportunism in the moment. The instinct of a politician who has spent a career turning other people's crises into leverage. "She doesn't know," he said, and there was something almost gleeful buried under the fear in his voice, a small, vicious satisfaction at finally having something to trade. "DeLuca, she has no idea what you are, does she? You've been playing house with her for weeks, and she still thinks you're some hospital executive." "Shut your mouth," Roman said, low and lethal. "Roman DeLuca," Holloway continued anyway, "because men cornered enough will always reach for whatever weapon is closest, even a true one, even one that costs them later. Vivian, sweetheart, you should ask your hospital administrator how many men have disappeared because they crossed his organization. Ask him how many city contracts get rigged because of payments his family's been running through unions and ports for 30 years. Ask him what capo means, because I'm guessing you heard that word somewhere recently and didn't have anyone to translate it for you." The room went silent in a way that felt, to Vivian, like the air itself had been pulled out of it. She stared at the back of Roman's head, at the rigid line of his shoulders, waiting, desperately, with everything left in her, for him to turn around and tell her it wasn't true. that Holloway was lying out of spite and fear, that the man who'd brought her coffee at 3 in the morning and talked about a stranger's lullaby with something close to reverence in his voice was not the same man Holloway was describing. Roman turned around. He didn't lie to her. That was in the end the thing she would hold on to in the weeks that followed, the single mercy in an otherwise unbearable moment. He looked at her with an expression stripped of every careful performance he'd given her over the last month, and told her the truth with his whole, exhausted face before he said a single word. "It's true," he said quietly. "All of it. I run an organization that does things I am not proud of. I have done things I am not proud of. I was going to tell you. I should have told you weeks ago, and I didn't, because I was afraid of exactly this moment. And now it's happening in the worst possible way, in front of the worst possible person, and I am sorry, Vivian. I am more sorry than I know how to say." Vivian felt the floor of her own life tilt under her, the same gray creeping in at the edges of her vision that had taken her down in triage weeks ago, except this time it wasn't exhaustion pulling her under. It was the architecture of the last month collapsing all at once, every gentle moment recoloring itself, every cup of coffee and every quiet conversation now wearing a question mark she hadn't known to ask. Was any of it real? Was any of it real? Was any of it real? She didn't get the chance to ask, because that was the precise moment the lights in the office flickered once, hard, and went out. The blackout wasn't citywide yet. That would come later. In the climax, neither of them could see coming from inside this single dark room. But the floor went dark all at once, emergency lighting kicking in along the baseboards a half-second later, casting everything in a thin red glow that turned the elegant office into something closer to a stage set for violence. "That's not the grid," Roman said immediately, his entire posture shifting, the wounded honesty of 30 seconds ago burned away instantly by pure animal alertness. Sal, talk to me." His earpiece crackled. Vivian, standing frozen in the red emergency light with one hand locked over her stomach, watched Roman's face change as he listened, watched the blood drain further from already pale skin. "They cut the building's main feed," Roman said, mostly to himself, processing out loud the way men do under sudden pressure. "Manual override on the backup generators failed, which means somebody got to the generators before we did, which means—" He stopped himself, looked at Holloway, and something brutal moved across his face. "Which means this was never just about a negotiation. You weren't planning to let her walk out of here with $2 million and a signed contract, were you? Senator, you were planning to let your friends handle the rest while you stayed clean." Holloway, in the red light, looked smaller than he had a minute ago, all his careful composure stripped away to reveal a frightened man who had, for the first time, fully understood the size of the thing he'd set in motion. I told them to wait. I told them this was a conversation first." "You don't get to control men like that once you've invited them in," Roman said. "You should have learned that before you made the call." The office door burst open. Two men came through it fast, dressed in black, faces uncovered in a way that told Vivian, with a cold, clean horror, that they didn't intend for anyone in this room to be alive long enough to identify them later. The first one's gun came up before he'd even cleared the doorway, swinging toward the cluster of bodies near Holloway's desk, and the next 3 seconds happened faster than Vivian's mind could fully process them. Roman moved, not toward cover, toward her, his body crossing the distance between them in a single stride, both arms wrapping around her and pulling her down and sideways behind the heavy oak corner of Holloway's desk, a half-second before the first shot cracked through the dark office, the sound enormous and flat and final in the enclosed space, a sound Vivian felt in her chest before her ears had even finished registering it. Holloway screamed something wordless. A second shot followed the first, then a third, glass shattering somewhere behind them. The window, the lake view, cold air suddenly pouring into the room from 40 floors up. "Stay down," Roman said into her ear, his body curled over hers, shielding her stomach with his own chest in a position that left him almost entirely exposed to the room behind him. Stay down, I have you up." Vivian couldn't speak. Her whole body had locked into something beyond fear, some animal place past conscious thought, her arms wrapped around her belly. Roman's weight pressing her into the floor behind the desk, while gunfire continued to crack through the red-lit dark above them, while somewhere across the room she heard Holloway's voice break into something close to a whimper, heard one more shot, heard a heavy, wet sound that she understood, with sick clarity, was a body hitting the floor. Though whose body, she couldn't tell, couldn't see, could only lie there with her face pressed against the carpet and her heart hammering against Roman's arm and pray, in words she hadn't used since childhood, that the next sound wasn't the one that ended everything. A new voice cut through the chaos. Not the shooters, someone else, shouting orders in a clipped, controlled register that Vivian recognized, distantly, as the voice from the parking garage, the broad, gray-templed man Roman had called Sal. "Clear, clear! Boss, you good? Boss!" "We're behind the desk," Roman called back, his voice tight but steady, still curled protectively over Vivian's body. "Get her out of here, Sal. Now, I don't care how. Get her out of this building." The gunfire had stopped. In its place came new sounds, bodies moving fast, the particular controlled chaos of trained men handling an aftermath. Somewhere a radio crackling with words like secure and two down and non-fatal. Repeat, non-fatal, and underneath all of it, very close, Holloway's voice, thin and shaking and alive, repeating the same four words over and over like a man who could not quite believe his own survival. "I didn't mean this. I didn't mean this." Roman finally lifted his weight off Vivian, helping her up with hands that were, she noticed even through her own shock, shaking. The first time she had ever seen any part of Roman DeLuca shake. His eyes went immediately to her stomach, to her face, scanning her with a desperation that stripped away every last shred of the careful, composed man she'd known for the last month. "Are you hurt? Vivian, look at me. Are you hurt? Is the baby?" "I'm okay." Her own voice came out a stranger's whisper, thin and shaking. "I think I'm okay." Relief broke across his face for one unguarded second before the next wave of reality crashed back in. The broken window, the cold wind pouring through it, two men down on the floor near the door, Sal's people fanning out through the office with weapons drawn. Holloway slumped against his own desk with blood on his shirt that Vivian would learn in the next breath wasn't his own, the result of standing too close to a man who hadn't survived the exchange. Roman pulled her to her feet, one arm locked around her shoulders, and for a moment they stood together in the wreckage of an office that had, 20 minutes ago, been the site of a calm, cold negotiation about money, and was now a crime scene with broken glass crunching underfoot and the distant wail of approaching sirens beginning to climb 40 floors up from the street. "This was never going to stay quiet," Roman said, mostly to himself, his eyes scanning the room with the cold calculation of a man already 3 moves ahead, already understanding that whatever fragile, careful secrecy had protected his double life for 15 years had just been blown wide open in front of a United States senator, federal authorities now inevitably inbound, and the one woman he'd spent a month trying to keep separate from all of it standing directly in the middle of the wreckage. He looked down at her, and something in his expression went past fear into a kind of grim, total resolve. The look of a man who has just understood that the only path forward requires abandoning every careful thing he's built. "I am done hiding what I am," he said. "I should have been done a month ago. Whatever happens next, Vivian, whatever you decide about me, about us, about any of it, I need you to understand that I am not letting anyone touch you or that baby ever again. Not Holloway, not the people he called, not anyone. I don't care what it costs me." Vivian looked at him, at the blood on his sleeve that wasn't his, at the steady, terrible certainty in his eyes, at the wreckage of a life he'd kept hidden from her finally laid bare in the worst possible circumstances, and felt something inside her own chest shift, irrevocably, from the woman who had run from a parking garage 12 hours ago into someone else entirely, someone harder, someone who understood, with sudden and total clarity, that there was no version of her life left that didn't include this man and the war that apparently came with him. "Okay," she said, and her voice, when it came, didn't shake at all. "Then get me somewhere safe, and then you're going to tell me everything, all of it. No more pieces." Sal appeared at the doorway, breathing hard, blood on his knuckles that belonged to someone else. "Boss, we need to move. Now." Kozlov's people had eyes on this building. This whole thing was a setup. Somebody tipped them off about the meeting time, and if they had eyes here, they've got eyes on St. Dominic too. If they're moving on the senator's deal today, they're moving on her too, and they're not going to wait for a quiet office. They're going to come for her wherever she feels safest. Roman's jaw tightened, the full shape of the danger finally crystallizing in front of him. Not a single ambush in a downtown office, but the opening move of a war that had already, without his realizing it, gathered enough momentum to come straight through the front doors of the one place he'd promised himself would always be a sanctuary. "Then we go to St. Dominic," he said, "and we make sure nothing on this earth gets through those doors." He didn't know yet, as he said it, how soon those words would be tested. That within 48 hours, the hospital that had hidden his empire's secrets for 15 years would become the single most dangerous building in the city. That the war he'd just declared in a glass-walled office downtown was only the opening shot of something far larger. Something that would require him to burn every careful thing he'd built in order to save the one person who had ever made him want to build something different instead. But standing in the wreckage with Vivian's hand gripped tight in his own, glass crunching under their feet, and sirens climbing closer through the broken window, Roman DeLuca understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has just crossed a line he can never walk back across, that there was no version of his life left that didn't end in blood, and the only question that mattered now was whose. St. Dominic looked different at night when you knew what it really was. Vivian sat in the back of Roman's car as it tore through downtown streets, still wet with melted slush, refreezing under streetlights, her hands locked together in her lap to keep them from shaking, watching the hospital's pale stone facade rise up out of the dark ahead of them. The fountain still running even now, even in February, water catching the security lights like something almost peaceful, almost normal, a lie the building had been telling the whole city for years. 40 minutes, Sal said from the front seat. Phone pressed to his ear, voice clipped. Maybe less. Kozlov's people move fast when they're motivated, and a dead senator's bodyguard plus 2 of their own shooters down means somebody upstairs is plenty motivated right now. The senator's not dead, Roman said. Senator's not the one I'm worried about. Sal glanced back at Vivian, just once, an apology in it. No offense, ma'am. None taken, Vivian said, and was surprised by how flat and steady her own voice sounded. Like some part of her had already accepted what was coming and simply skipped past the part where it terrified her. Though that wasn't true, not really. The terror was still there, sitting under her ribs like a second pulse. It had just stopped being useful to listen to. Roman's hand found hers in the dark of the back seat, and she let him take it, because whatever she felt about the last 24 hours, the parking garage, the lies, the gunfire, none of it changed the simple physics of the situation. He was the only solid thing in a world that had come apart at the seams, and right now solid was the only quality that mattered. Talk to me, she said. Real talk, Roman. Not careful. What's coming? He was quiet for a second, and in the passing wash of streetlight she watched him decide, visibly, to give her the truth instead of the comfortable version of it. The Kozlov family's been trying to take territory from mine for 3 years. Tonight they got handed an opening. Holloway's people made contact, offered them you in exchange for a piece of the docks. And somewhere in that exchange, I became collateral too, because anybody who's been watching knows by now that touching you means going through me. His jaw tightened. They're not going to come quiet. They're not going to come small. They lost men today. They're going to come back bigger, and they're going to come back angry. And the easiest building in this city for me to lose control of right now is the one we're driving toward, because it's full of patients and doctors and people who have absolutely nothing to do with any of this. Then why are we going there? Because it's also the only building in this city I can lock down floor by floor in under 10 minutes, with men I trust on every exit. And because he stopped, and something in his throat worked once before he finished the sentence. Because you're 7 months pregnant, Vivian. And if anything happens tonight, I need you somewhere with an operating room and an NICU and people who know how to save a baby born too early. I am not running you to a safe house with nothing but men with guns. I'm running you somewhere with both. She didn't have an answer for that. She just held his hand tighter, watching the hospital grow larger through the windshield, watching it stop looking like a sanctuary and start looking, for the first time in her 4 years working inside it, like exactly what it had apparently always secretly been. A fortress, walls thin as paper around a war that had been quietly running underneath the whole building the entire time she'd badged in every morning, believing she worked somewhere safe. They were inside for 6 minutes before the first warning came. Roman moved through St. Dominic's lobby like a different man than the one who'd carried coffee to her at 3 in the morning. Faster, harder, every word out of his mouth in order, every order obeyed instantly by men in plain dark suits who materialized from corners of the hospital Vivian had never noticed held anyone at all. Doctors and nurses on the night shift watched with confused, uneasy faces as the lobby filled with armed men trying very hard to look like they weren't armed, as exits that were normally propped open for staff smoke breaks were quietly, efficiently secured. Lock the east stairwell. Nobody in or out without a badge and a face I personally vouch for, Roman said into his phone, taking the stairs 2 at a time toward the executive floor with Vivian close behind him, Sal at her other side like a second wall. Pull every available man off the docks. I don't care what shipment's sitting there. This building matters more tonight than anything we've got moving on the water. And somebody get Doctor Ferris up to the executive floor. I want an obstetrician on standby who isn't going to ask questions. Understood? Now. He kept talking, kept moving, kept issuing orders in a voice gone hard and flat and utterly without hesitation. And Vivian, climbing the stairs behind him with one hand pressed to the ache settling low in her back, found herself watching him with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite awe. Something closer to recognition. The understanding that the gentleness she'd fallen for in dim hallways had never been a performance covering this. They were both real. They had always both been real. The same man capable of standing at a nursery window talking about a stranger's lullaby, and capable of locking down an entire hospital with the cold precision of a general, and somehow, impossibly, in the middle of all this terror, that fact didn't scare her the way it had 12 hours ago. It steadied her. It would have to, because the lights went out 4 minutes later. Not just the executive floor, not just St. Dominic. The blackout rolled across 3 city blocks at once, a hard mechanical thud followed by silence, followed by the building's emergency systems kicking in with a stuttering half-second delay, red emergency lighting flooding the stairwell, alarms beginning to wail somewhere far below in the ER. That's not a grid failure, Roman said immediately, already moving, already pulling his weapon from beneath his jacket in a motion so practiced it barely registered as motion at all. Sal, on it. Sal's voice had gone hard, professional, every trace of warmth burned out of it. Substation 2 blocks out, they hit it on purpose, knew exactly which lines fed this building. This isn't a smash and grab, boss, this is a planned assault. Vivian's heart slammed against her ribs so hard it felt like it might crack something. Below them, through the stairwell's narrow windows, she could see the chaos beginning to unfold across the hospital's lower floors. Emergency lighting throwing the lobby into stark red and black, shapes moving through it that didn't belong there, fast and coordinated in a way that civilians running for cover never were. They're already inside, Roman said, and for the first time since she'd met him, she heard something close to genuine fear crack through the flat control in his voice. Sal, get her to the maternity floor, lock it down, full team. Nobody gets through that door who isn't on the cleared list. I'm not leaving you, Vivian said. You are not staying anywhere near gunfire, 7 months pregnant, Vivian. I don't care what you... I'm not asking permission. Her voice cracked through the stairwell with more force than her exhausted body had any right to produce, and something in her own chest surprised her with how true it felt, how clean. The same instinct from the ER, the same refusal to simply stand still and let violence wash over someone else while she hid. But I'm also not stupid. Get me to the maternity floor. Lock me in. But don't you dare die down here thinking I left without telling you I... She stopped herself, the word catching, too large and too true to say in a stairwell full of red light and approaching gunfire. Roman looked at her for one suspended second, something raw moving behind his eyes. And then the moment broke, because the stairwell door 3 floors below them slammed open and the first burst of gunfire tore up through the concrete shaft, deafening, the muzzle flash strobing red-orange against red emergency light. And Sal was already moving, already pulling Vivian by the arm up and away from the railing, already shouting into his radio for backup on the east stairwell. Go, go, go! Roman shoved her toward Sal, his own body turning to put himself between her and the stairwell below, weapon already up, and the last thing Vivian saw before Sal hauled her through the door onto the 11th floor was Roman DeLuca firing down into the dark, his face lit in red strobing flashes, every trace of gentleness burned away into something that looked, in that single frozen image, like exactly what Holloway had warned her he was. She didn't have time to feel what that did to her. Sal was already running her down the hallway toward the maternity wing, her feet slapping against tile slick with someone's spilled coffee, her lungs burning, the baby inside her shifting hard and frantic like it could feel the chaos through her own racing blood. The maternity wing had already gone into lockdown by the time they reached it, nurses moving newborns into reinforced inner rooms, mothers wheeled away from windows, the particular controlled panic of trained medical staff doing their jobs under conditions no training program had ever fully prepared them for. Sal pushed Vivian through the doors and into the corridor, where 4 of Roman's men had already taken position, weapons drawn, faces set. "Stay behind the desk," Sal said. "Stay low. You so much as hear a door rattle that isn't one of ours, you get into that supply closet and you barricade it. You understand me? Where's Roman?" "Doing what he does." Sal's radio crackled, a burst of static and clipped voices, and his face tightened in a way that told her, before he said anything, that the news wasn't good. "They've got 3 teams inside the building: lobby, east stairwell, and somebody just hit the parking structure access on sub-level 2. This isn't a hit squad, Miss Mercer. This is an invasion." Vivian sank into the chair behind the nurse's station because her legs had simply stopped being willing to hold her up, one hand locked over her belly, listening to gunfire echo up through the building's bones from somewhere far below, feeling each contraction of fear tighten, something low in her own body that, with growing and terrible clarity, did not feel like fear at all. It felt like pain. Sharp, specific, gathering low across her abdomen, in a way she recognized immediately, and with total horror, because she'd watched this exact thing happen to 100 patients across 4 years working the ER, had talked to 100 frightened women through exactly this sensation, and had never once imagined it happening to her own body in the middle of a building under siege. "No," she breathed. "No, no, not now. Miss Mercer." One of the nurses, a young woman named Priya, who'd worked beside Vivian for 2 years, was at her side instantly, professional instinct overriding her own visible fear. "What's wrong? Talk to me." "Contraction," Vivian managed, gritting her teeth as the pain peaked and then mercifully began to ease. I think it's starting." Priya's face went pale, then hardened into the same controlled focus Vivian had seen on her own face 1,000 times treating other people's emergencies. Okay, we're going to get you into a room. We're going to get you monitored." In the middle of this, Vivian let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, the absurdity and the terror tangling together until she couldn't separate them. "Priya, there are men with guns in this building, and you're 7 months pregnant and might be in labor, so unless you'd like to deliver behind a nurse's station, we're moving you." Priya's hand was already under her arm, hauling her up with a strength that surprised them both. "Let's go." But 3 floors down, Roman had run out of cover. He'd taken the east stairwell down 2 flights, dropping 2 of the Kozlov shooters before they'd even fully cleared the landing, his ears ringing from the enclosed gunfire. Blood, not his, not yet, sprayed warm across the back of his hand from a man who'd gotten close enough to grab his jacket before Sal's backup put him down from the floor above. His shoulder burned where a round had grazed close enough to tear fabric and skin both, a thin hot line of pain he didn't have time to fully register yet, adrenaline doing the work his nervous system would bill him for later. "Boss, lobby's clear. We pushed them back toward the loading dock," a voice crackled in his earpiece, one of his captains breathing hard. "But sub-level 2's a different story. They breached the parking structure. Looks like 8, maybe 10 men, heavier weapons than the lobby team. Marcus is pinned down by the elevator bank. We need..." The radio cut to static and gunfire, and Roman's stomach dropped through the floor. "Marcus, talk to me. Marcus!" Nothing but static. Roman moved before the fear could finish forming, taking the next flight down 2 steps at a time, weapon up, every nerve in his body screaming at him that this was the moment everything he'd built over 15 years either held or didn't. That somewhere below him, a man who'd served his family for a decade was bleeding out by an elevator bank while a small army tried to punch through into a building that held the one person Roman could not, would not, lose. He hit the door to sub-level 2 and the world exploded into noise. Muzzle flashes lit the dark concrete garage in strobing, disorienting bursts, the air thick with cordite, and dust kicked up from rounds chewing into pillars and parked cars. Roman dropped behind an overturned gurney someone had been using as cover, breathing hard, blood running warm down his arm now, his mind doing the fast, brutal math of a man who'd spent his whole adult life calculating odds and violence. 8 shooters, maybe more. 3 of his own men down or pinned, including Marcus, whose voice he could now hear somewhere to his left, ragged and pained but alive, which was the only mercy the universe had offered him in the last 90 seconds. "DeLuca!" a voice called out across the garage, accented, confident in a way that turned Roman's blood to ice. The voice of a man who believed, correctly or not, that he held the winning hand. "You should have stayed out of Holloway's business. This didn't have to cost you anything." "Sergei!" Roman recognized the voice now, placed it. Sergei Kozlov's youngest lieutenant, a man with a reputation for enjoying his work more than the job strictly required. "You hit my hospital. You think there's a version of tonight where this doesn't cost everyone something? We just want the girl, and whatever's left of the docks once you're done bleeding." Sergei's laugh echoed off concrete, ugly and confident. "Hand her over, walk away clean, or don't, and we take her anyway once you're done dying down here." Roman's hand tightened around his weapon, and something in his chest, already raw from a night spent watching every careful wall of his life come down at once, finally went past fear into something colder and more absolute. He thought of Vivian's hand in his in the back of the car. He thought of her voice cracking in the stairwell, the words she hadn't let herself finish saying. He thought of a nursery window and a lullaby a teenage mother sang to a baby who couldn't hear her yet, and the simple, devastating fact that he had spent 15 years building an empire designed to make him untouchable, and had never once, until this exact moment, understood what he actually wanted that empire to protect. "You're not getting anywhere near her," Roman said, and rose from behind the gurney, firing. Patat. On the maternity floor, Vivian lay in a delivery room with monitors strapped across her belly, Priya's hand gripping hers, the distant percussion of gunfire still audible even through reinforced walls, each contraction now coming hard and fast enough that the part of her mind still capable of clinical assessment understood, with rising dread, that this was not false labor. This was real, and it was early. And it was happening in the middle of a building under siege with the man she loved fighting for his life 4 floors below her. "You're at 6 centimeters, the obstetrician said. Dr. Ferris, an older woman with steady hands and a voice that didn't waver, even as the lights flickered once, twice, the building's emergency generators straining under a load they hadn't been designed for. "This baby is coming tonight, Vivian. Whether any of us are ready or not, I need you to breathe with me." "Roman," Vivian gasped through a contraction, her whole body seizing around the pain. "Is there any word?" "Focus on breathing," Priya said gently, squeezing her hand. "He's still fighting. Sal's people are still in the fight. That's all we know right now, and right now you have a job too." Vivian nodded, tears streaking sideways into her hair as she lay back against the pillow, every part of her torn between 2 terrors that refused to resolve into one. The baby fighting to arrive too early in a building full of gunfire, and the man 4 floors down whose voice she might never hear again, and somewhere underneath both of those terrors a third thing rising up that she hadn't expected, a fierce, burning resolve that felt, in this exact moment, like the only thing strong enough to hold the other 2 terrors at bay. Survive, she told herself, told the child fighting its way into a world already at war around it, told some absent version of Roman she prayed was still breathing 4 floors below. Just survive. All 3 of us. Whatever it takes. Another contraction seized her, harder than the last, and somewhere in the building below, in a parking garage thick with smoke and blood and the screaming aftermath of close-range gunfire, Roman DeLuca was making exactly the same promise to himself, fighting through pain and exhaustion and a wound in his shoulder that had finally started to slow him down. Every shot he fired now aimed with the single, narrowing focus of a man who understood, with total clarity, that he was not fighting for territory or reputation or the empire his father had built before him. He was fighting for a delivery room 4 floors up, and the woman inside it, and a child he hadn't even met yet, who already meant more to him than 15 years of blood-soaked inheritance ever had. "Marcus, can you move?" Roman shouted across the garage, reloading with hands that had started finally to shake. I can move, Marcus gritted back, dragging himself behind a concrete pillar, blood soaking through his sleeve. Boss, there's too many. We need... I know what we need. Roman's voice came out flat, final. A decision already made. Sal, you copy? Static, then Sal's voice, breathless, running. Copy, boss. I'm 2 floors up, pushing toward you. Don't. Roman's eyes scanned the garage, found Sergei Kozlov's men fanning out wider, flanking, the math getting worse with every passing second. Stay with her. Whatever happens down here, you do not leave that maternity floor. You understand me? If I don't make it back up those stairs, you keep her and that baby alive if it's the last thing you ever do for this family. Boss, don't talk like that. I'm not asking, Sal. I'm ordering. Stay with her. He didn't wait for an answer. He rose from behind the gurney into the strobing dark, weapon up, blood running warm down his arm, and walked directly toward the sound of Sergei Kozlov's voice, because somewhere in the last 15 minutes, Roman DeLuca had stopped calculating odds entirely and started doing something he hadn't done since he was 26 years old, and first understood what it meant to have absolutely nothing left to lose. He started fighting like a man with everything to lose instead, and the difference in close-quarters violence was not subtle. The first shooter who stepped into his path went down before he'd fully registered Roman's approach. The second got off a single wild shot that tore through the air a foot from Roman's skull, before Roman closed the distance and ended it without slowing his stride at all. Every motion economical, brutal, the product of 15 years spent learning exactly how to survive moments like this one, stripped down to pure, terrible instinct. Pain screamed up his wounded shoulder with every recoil. He didn't slow down. Somewhere above him, 4 floors up, a woman who had once told him she didn't want to watch anyone else die in front of her was fighting her own battle, and Roman understood, with total and burning clarity, that the only acceptable outcome tonight was one where both of those battles ended in survival. Sergei! Roman's voice tore raw out of his throat, echoing off concrete slick with blood that belonged to men on both sides now. Come finish this yourself, or are you only brave behind men you're willing to spend? The garage went quiet for one suspended second, the kind of quiet that meant something was about to break entirely. And then Sergei Kozlov stepped out from behind a support column with a weapon raised and a smile on his face that belonged to a man who had not yet understood how badly the night was about to turn against him. And Roman DeLuca, bleeding, exhausted, running on nothing but fury and love and 15 years of violence, finally pointed in a direction that felt, for the first time, like it actually meant something. Sergei Kozlov never got the shot off. Roman closed the last 6 feet between them before the other man's finger finished its slow tightening on the trigger, driving his good shoulder into Sergei's chest with the full, desperate weight of every hour of that night behind it. The parking garage, the office downtown, the woman 4 floors up fighting her own war while his blood ran down his arm in a steady, warm line he'd stopped feeling an hour ago. They went down together hard against the concrete, the gun skittering off into the dark, and what followed wasn't clean. And it wasn't fast. It was 2 exhausted men trading blows that had stopped being precise hours ago, fists and elbows, and the desperate animal grappling of men who both understood that whoever stood up first got to keep breathing. Roman won because he had something Sergei didn't. Sergei was fighting for territory, for a payday, for the satisfaction of finally beating the DeLuca name into the ground after years of losing ground to it. Roman was fighting for a delivery room 4 floors up, and that kind of reason didn't tire the way greed did. He drove his forearm across Sergei's throat and held it there, both of them gasping, blood and sweat mixing on broken concrete, until the other man's struggling slowed, then stopped, then gave way to the particular stillness of a man choosing to live by surrendering instead of dying by pride. Roman released him, rolled off, lay flat on his back on the cold concrete floor of his own parking garage for 3 full seconds, chest heaving, vision swimming at the edges, and let himself feel, just for those 3 seconds, the full weight of how close tonight had actually come to ending everything. Boss! Sal's voice, close now, real now, not static, hands under his arms, hauling him up. Boss, you're bleeding bad. We need to get you up to... She's first. Roman's voice came out wrecked, barely his own. Vivian, tell me she's in labor, Sal said, and something in his face made Roman's heart stop entirely before the next word landed. She's okay, boss. She's okay, but the baby's coming. It's coming now, and they need you up there. Both of you need to be up there. Roman didn't remember the stairs. He would think about that later, the way trauma erased entire stretches of time. It didn't think the mind could afford to keep. One second he was on his back on the garage floor, certain he was dying, certain at minimum that he'd never walk again without the limp this night would leave him, and the next he was shouldering through the doors of the maternity floor with blood soaking his shirt to the waist. Not all of it his. Sal half carrying him the last 20 feet, every nurse and doctor in the hallway turning to stare at the sight of him. Billionaire, mafia boss. The man who'd just won and lost a war in the same building in the same hour. Stumbling toward a delivery room like the only thing left in the world that mattered. Boss, Vivian heard him before she saw him. She was deep in the part of labor that stopped being about anything except the next contraction, the next breath. Dr. Ferris's steady voice counting her through it, Priya's hand crushed in her own. And then there was noise at the door, raised voices. Someone saying, "Sir, you cannot. You're not sterile, you're bleeding." And Roman's voice cutting through all of it, ragged and absolute. "I am not missing this." He came through the door looking like something out of a war Vivian had only read about. Shirt torn and soaked through with blood at the shoulder, face streaked with sweat and dirt, and a thin dark line where something had cut close to his eyebrow, moving with the particular careful stiffness of a man whose body had taken more punishment than it was built to absorb in one night, and simply hadn't gotten the message yet that it was allowed to stop. "Roman!" Her voice cracked on his name, relief and terror, and 12 hours of unbearable fear breaking out of her all at once. "You're hurt." "I'm fine." He crossed the room to her side, ignoring Dr. Ferris's protest, ignoring the nurse trying to push him toward triage, ignoring everything except the sight of her face, flushed and exhausted and alive, and the monitor beside her bed tracking a heartbeat that wasn't either of theirs. "I'm not going anywhere. Not tonight. Not ever again." "It's almost over down there?" she gasped through gritted teeth as another contraction built. "The fighting?" "Sergei's people are done. Federal agents are already in the building. Somebody finally called this in loud enough that local police couldn't sit on it anymore. It's over, Vivian. Whatever happens in the next 20 minutes, the war part is over." His hand found hers, his blood-streaked fingers lacing through her own. "Right now, there's only one thing happening in this room that matters." "You need a doctor," Dr. Ferris said sharply, eyeing the blood-soaked shoulder. "I'll get one in 20 minutes." Roman didn't look away from Vivian's face. "Right now, I'm exactly where I need to be." Dr. Ferris, who had delivered thousands of babies and had clearly never once had a patient's labor accompanied by an active gun battle 4 floors below, made the executive decision that arguing with a bleeding mafia boss in the middle of a crisis delivery was a fight she didn't have time for, and turned her attention back to Vivian instead. "Okay, you're fully dilated. Next contraction, I need you to push, and I need everything you've got left." Vivian, gripping Roman's hand hard enough to leave marks, found something in her body she hadn't known was still there after a night like this one. Not strength exactly, something closer to refusal, the same stubborn refusal that had once stepped her between a stranger and a gun, now turned toward the single most important thing she had ever had to fight for. "Okay," she gasped. "Okay, I'm ready." The next 11 minutes contained more honesty than the entire month that preceded them. Roman stayed exactly where he was, blood drying stiff against torn fabric, his own pain a distant, manageable thing compared to what he was watching Vivian move through, his voice low and constant in her ear between contractions. Not platitudes, not the careful, gentle nothings men were supposed to say in these moments, but something rawer, truer, words that came out of him without the usual 15 years of careful filtering. "I should have told you everything the first night," he said, his forehead pressed to her temple, her hand crushing his fingers white. "I told myself I was protecting you. I wasn't. I was protecting myself because I was afraid of exactly the look you gave me in that office today, and I let that fear cost you a night you should never have had to survive." "Roman," she broke off into a groan of effort, pushing, Dr. Ferris's voice rising in encouragement, Priya counting steadily at her other side. "I'm not finished," he said, quieter now, urgent. "Because I need you to hear this before whatever happens next, before this baby comes and the whole rest of our lives starts. I have spent 15 years building something I told myself mattered. Power, territory, money nobody could ever take from me again." His voice roughened, raw in a way she'd never heard from him. Tonight I watched men die in my own parking garage over a fight that started because I let myself fall for you instead of staying invisible the way I was trained to be, and I have never once, in 15 years, regretted anything less. You're the only thing I have ever wanted that wasn't about surviving. I want to build a life. With you. With whoever's about to come screaming into this room. I don't care what it costs me to walk away from everything else. You don't get to make speeches, Vivian gasped, half laughing through the pain, tears streaking down into her hair. While I'm doing this. One more push, Dr. Ferris said. Big one, Vivian. Right now. Vivian bore down with everything she had left in her exhausted body, Roman's hand locked in hers, his own breath matching the rhythm of her effort like he could somehow share the burden of it through sheer force of will, and the room went still, and then, all at once, didn't. The cry that broke the silence was small and furious and absolutely, perfectly alive. A girl, Dr. Ferris said, her own voice catching with something that wasn't strictly professional. You have a daughter, Roman DeLuca, the most feared man in Chicago's underworld, a man who had walked into a parking garage 20 minutes earlier and ended another man's life with his bare hands, looked down at the small, furious, screaming creature being laid against Vivian's chest, and felt something in his own chest crack open completely, 15 years of careful armor giving way all at once. And the tears that came weren't anything he tried to stop. She's perfect, he said, voice wrecked, kneeling beside the bed so his face was level with both of theirs, one bloodied hand coming up to touch, with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible from a man built the way he was, the impossibly small curve of his daughter's head. She's perfect, Vivian. Look what you did. Look what you just did. Look what we did, Vivian whispered, exhaustion and joy and 12 straight hours of terror finally breaking loose from her all at once, tears running freely now, her free hand reaching up to touch the dried blood at his jaw, to confirm with her own fingers that he was real and alive, and here. You came back. You actually came back. I told you. His forehead dropped to rest against hers, both of them shaking, both of them finally allowed to stop fighting. Nothing on this earth was getting through those doors. The federal agents who finally secured St. Dominic that night found a building that told a story almost too large to process in one report. 2 dead Kozlov soldiers in the parking structure, 3 more in custody, weapons seized that connected directly to a trafficking operation federal task forces had been quietly building a case against for 2 years. A senator found cowering behind his own desk 40 floors up in a downtown office, alive but compromised beyond any political recovery, the wire transfers and shell company documents. Roman's people had been quietly compiling for weeks suddenly, conveniently, finding their way into evidence the moment agents needed probable cause to start pulling threads. It took 8 months for the full story to surface in the press, and when it did, it surfaced in pieces shaped carefully by people who understood exactly which threads to pull and which to leave buried. Senator Gregory Halloway resigned within the week, citing health reasons that fooled absolutely no one, and was indicted 4 months later on charges of campaign finance fraud and conspiracy connected to organized crime, charges built on evidence almost too neat in its completeness, evidence that the federal prosecutors handling the case never quite traced back to its actual source, because the actual source had spent 15 years learning exactly how to make information appear without his fingerprints anywhere on it. He was sentenced to 11 years. The Kozlov organization, already weakened by 2 years of federal pressure and the catastrophic loss of men and territory in a single chaotic night, collapsed within 18 months, its remaining leadership either in custody or scattered to cities that didn't remember their names. Roman DeLuca's name appeared in none of it. Not once. Whatever the official record said about that night at St. Dominic, it described an isolated security incident, a deranged intruder, a tragedy contained and resolved by hospital security and prompt police response. The other version of the story, the real one, lived only in the memories of the people who'd survived it, and in the quiet, permanent decision Roman made in the weeks that followed to dismantle, piece by careful piece, the empire that had nearly cost him everything that actually mattered. It didn't happen overnight. Vivian understood that. watching it unfold over the following months from the strange new vantage point of new motherhood and a relationship neither of them had a map for. That 15 years of built infrastructure, of loyalties and debts and obligations that ran deeper than any one man's choice to walk away, couldn't simply be switched off because Roman had decided, in a single transformative night, that he wanted something different. But he tried. She watched him try, exhausted, methodical, often furious with himself at how slow it went, selling off the pieces of the organization that could be sold legitimately, severing ties with men his father had trusted that Roman no longer could, funneling what remained of 15 years of accumulated wealth into channels that could be defended in daylight. He met with Sal more times than Vivian could count, long, quiet conversations behind closed doors that she didn't ask about. And Roman, true to a promise he'd made her in a delivery room, no longer hid from her entirely either. Not every detail, some things a man like Roman would carry alone for the rest of his life, debts owed to people who'd died protecting choices he'd made, but the shape of it, the honest shape of what he was doing and why, he gave her that. He never made her guess again. "It won't be clean," he told her one night, 6 weeks after the birth, sitting on the floor of the small house he'd quietly purchased outside the city. A house with no executive floor, no observation deck, nothing built for watching anyone from a distance. Their daughter asleep against his bare chest, in the particular boneless way of infants, who trusted completely that the arms holding them would not let go. "Some of what I built can't be undone. Some of the money will always have blood somewhere underneath it, no matter how many legitimate businesses I bury it in. I need you to understand that before you decide what kind of life you actually want to build with me." Vivienne sat beside him, watching their daughter's small chest rise and fall against his, and thought about the version of herself who had stood in triage 3 months ago with nothing but a stranger's life to protect and her own quiet, stubborn refusal to look away from what needed doing. "Nobody gets a clean past, Roman," she said. "I spent 8 months pregnant and alone because I trusted a man who turned out to be a coward dressed up in a good suit. You spent 15 years building something soaked in things you're not proud of. Neither one of us gets to pretend the road here was clean." And she reached over, resting her hand against the small of their daughter's back, feeling the impossible warmth of her, the steady, tiny heartbeat under her palm. "What matters is what we build next, not what we can't undo. You make it sound simple. It's not simple. It's just true." She looked at him, at the new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 4 months ago, the particular exhausted softness that had crept into his face since the night their daughter was born. A man who had spent his whole adult life being feared finally learning, slowly, what it felt like to be needed instead. "I'm not asking you to erase who you were. I'm asking you to keep choosing, every day, who you're going to be instead." "That's all anybody gets to do. That's all I've ever done." St. Dominic reopened to full operations within a month of the attack. Its public story carefully managed, its private ownership quietly, permanently restructured. Roman transferred controlling interest into an independent charitable trust within the year, stepping back from day-to-day operations entirely, retaining only an advisory seat that let him keep funding the expansion projects that mattered most to him. The NICU doubled in size within 18 months, a satellite clinic on the west side that opened its doors 2 blocks from the children's shelter where Vivian had once volunteered every Saturday morning, now staffed in part by nurses she had personally helped recruit. She went back to work 11 weeks after the birth, against the advice of nearly everyone around her because sitting at home with grief and gratitude tangled together in her chest had started to feel like its own kind of danger. And the only thing that had ever quieted the noise in her own head was being useful to someone who needed her. She didn't go back to the ER floor. Roman never asked her to step back from anything. That was a fight she'd been braced for and never had to have. Because the man who showed up in the months after that night understood, better than anyone, what it cost a person to have their choices made for them. But she found, on her own, that something in her had shifted permanently the night she watched a building come apart around her and a child arrive into the wreckage of it anyway. She wanted to build something instead of just surviving inside it. She took the position when it was offered to her 8 months later, Director of Maternal Care, a newly created role overseeing the hospital's expanded high-risk obstetrics program, built specifically around the population she understood best, because she'd lived inside it herself. Women without partners, without family, without anyone in the waiting room, women who showed up to triage alone and exhausted, and determined not to ask for help even when they desperately needed it. She built the program around the principle that had once been the only thing keeping her upright at 3 in the morning, $50 a month against a debt that wasn't even hers anymore. That nobody should have to face the hardest thing in their life with no one standing beside them. But the wedding, when it finally happened, was small. Vivian insisted on that, and Roman, who had spent 15 years surrounded by rooms full of people who feared him, and almost none who actually knew him, didn't argue. They held it in the hospital's small rooftop garden on a Saturday afternoon in May, surrounded by perhaps 30 people. Hospital staff who'd become something closer to family over the years, a handful of Roman's people who had made the same choice he had and walked away from the old life rather than stay inside it. Sal standing at Roman's side in a suit that fit him badly, and an expression that, for one of the only times in 15 years of service, looked unguarded. Their daughter, 14 months old by then, sat in Priya's lap through most of the ceremony, more interested in the flowers woven through the garden railing than in the two adults exchanging vows a few feet away. And Vivian would think, looking back on it years later, that there was something exactly right about that. About a baby too young to understand any of it, too young to know about parking garages and stairwells and a senator's cowardice and a night that had nearly taken everything, simply existing in the moment the way children did, present and unburdened, the entire point of everything that had come before her. Roman knelt during the vows, not part of the ceremony, a spontaneous break from whatever script the officiant had prepared, simple words instead of an elaborate proposal. Because by then there had already been a ring and an answer months earlier. In the quiet of their own kitchen, no audience required for the part that actually mattered. No empire ever mattered, he told her, his voice carrying just far enough for the small gathered crowd to hear it, his hands wrapped around both of hers. Not the money, not the power, none of it. You walked into my hospital 8 months pregnant and exhausted and alone, believing the whole world had already decided what you were worth. And you were wrong about that, Vivian. You were always wrong about that. Vivian, tears already falling, found their daughter's eyes across the small crowd, wide and curious, watching her parents with the open, unself-conscious attention only a small child could give, and felt the entire weight of everything that had happened settle, finally, into something that no longer felt like a wound at all. It felt, instead, like the foundation of something solid. I wasn't alone, she whispered back to him, smiling through the tears, her voice breaking on the words even as she meant every syllable of them completely. I just didn't know yet that someone had already started waiting to find me. Years later, and there were years, ordinary and good, in the particular unremarkable way that hard-won peace always turns out to be, full of school recitals and scraped knees and Roman teaching a small, fierce, stubborn girl to ride a bicycle in the quiet street outside the house with no executive floor. Vivian would sometimes stand at the window of her office on St. Dominic's maternal care floor, looking down at the same ambulance bay Roman had once watched from 60 feet above. And think about the woman who had walked through those doors on a freezing January morning with nowhere else to go. That woman hadn't known, stepping between a stranger and a gun with nothing but stubbornness and an empty stomach to spend, that she was about to discover the truest thing about herself. Not that she was brave, though she was, but that the instinct to stand between someone she loved and whatever threatened them was the one part of her that had never once needed fixing, never once needed anyone's permission, the one part of her that had carried her, unbroken. Through every version of abandonment life had handed her until it finally led her somewhere worth staying. St. Dominic still stood at the center of the city, dark glass and pale stone, the fountain out front running even through winter, looking from the street like exactly what it had become. Not a building hiding violence beneath polished floors, but a place that had earned, slowly and at enormous cost, the right to call itself a sanctuary. The empire that had once moved silently through its basements and back corridors was gone, dismantled piece by piece by a man who had decided, on the worst night of his life, that the only kingdom worth keeping was the one built out of the people he protected rather than the people he controlled. Roman never fully escaped what he'd been. Vivian understood that, had made her peace with it years ago, watching him some nights stand a little too still at windows, watching him flinch, rarely now, but still sometimes, at sounds that recalled other sounds from another life. But she had learned in the years since that February night that healing was never the same thing as erasing, and that the measure of a man wasn't the darkness he'd once carried, but what he chose, every ordinary day after, to build instead. The greatest power he'd ever held, it turned out, had nothing to do with empires at all. It was simply this: a kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, their daughter doing homework with her tongue between her teeth in fierce concentration, Roman's hand finding Vivian's beneath the table the way it always did, no audience, no stakes, nothing left to prove to anyone, just two people who had walked through fire together and chosen, every single day since, to keep choosing each other. That was the whole of it, in the end. Not the war, not the empire, won or lost, just the people he'd loved enough to walk away from everything else to keep.